Hello everybody, your pal 6Speed here, and today we are doing another lecture, this time on steering, suspension, and alignment. I'm going to split this video this lecture into three separate parts. I have a notoriety for going on forever, so I don't want to bore you all with this whole thing in one big long shot. So we are going to split this up into little bitty parts here. So part one is on suspension principles, shock absorbers, and we're going to go over solid axial suspensions. So we're going to go over just about everything to do with suspension, steering, and alignment as it relates to kind of your everyday commuter car type of thing. We're not going to go into like supercars and all their crazy technology and stuff like that. That will probably be a video for another day. I'm really sorry I haven't been able to upload a video in a while. As some of you that follow me on social media know, I recently lost my grandfather, and I've been very, very burned out with work stuff, so it's been a little bit hard for me lately, but I'm back in the saddle again and hoping to do a little bit more regular uploading like I did back when I was a little bit younger. Anyway, point is, I'm happy to announce before we get going that I have recently, like just last week recently, reached 10,000 subscribers. So thank you all so much for subscribing and supporting me. I am very, very grateful to all of you. So thank you so much. So let's get rolling. So why do we need a suspension? Well, the suspension absorbs bumps to provide comfort to the vehicle passengers. Is one of the main things it does. But it also prevents the tires from losing grip due to the road imperfections and any kind of cornering that you might be doing. So it helps keep the tires firmly planted to the ground. So simply put, if the roads were perfectly flat and smooth with no imperfections, bumps, ripples, etc., we wouldn't need a suspension. Go-karts on a perfectly smooth floor don't need a suspension. They don't have a suspension. Now, without a suspension, if we hit a bump, the force generated would actually physically push the tire up off the ground. We'll get into that and the science behind that in a little bit. So we're going to start with the sciencey stuff, and pictured here is our friend Sir Isaac Newton. So we're going to explain this looking at Newton's three laws of motion. So the first law of motion is an object undergoing uniform motion will stay at its uniform motion if there is no net force applied to the body. Basically meaning if something is moving, it is going to stay moving if all the forces are equal on it. Same thing if it's at rest. It will stay at rest unless you put some kind of force to it. So if an object is at rest or zero velocity, it'll stay at rest unless you push it, which will change its velocity. It'll accelerate. This is known as the principle of inertia. So Newton's second law states that the velocity of an object will change when acted upon an external force. The net force on the object is equal to its mass multiplied by the rate of acceleration. Simply put, F net is equal to m times a. Newton's third law states that every action has an equal and opposite reaction. So if a 10-pound weight is resting on the table is exerting a 10-pound force onto the weight. If the table exerted 9 pounds of force, the weight would sink into the table. If the table exerted 11 pounds of force, the weight would jump off the table. Both actions are not physically possible. So if a vehicle is traveling down the road at a constant speed and a perfectly smooth road, the engine is going to exert enough force to overcome the rolling resistance of the tires, the frictional losses in the drivetrain, and any kind of drag force that's created by the vehicle moving through the air. The ground is providing the equal force to the vehicle weight so that our car isn't going to float up off the road or sink into the road. So this is what our force diagram looks like. We have the force of the engine pushing the vehicle forward, the force of drag and any kind of frictional losses, stuff like that, pulling the vehicle back. These are both equal, so the vehicle does not accelerate or decelerate. Deceleration is essentially negative acceleration. So our force of engine and our drag force are both identical, so the vehicle keeps on moving down the road at a constant speed. And our force of our road pushing up on the car is identical to the force of the weight of the vehicle pushing down on it. Now, when you hit a bump, basically what you're doing is you're just pushing up on the tire. In this case, we're hitting a bump with the right front tire or both front wheels, depending on the scenario. We'll just look at it from a 2D perspective right now. So that force, that net force is causing the vehicle to accelerate upwards. And that is equal to the mass times the acceleration. So think about it this way. If you had no suspension at all, the force of the bump would go straight into the body of the car. There's nothing that absorbs the bump. Let's assume for right now that the tire provides no shock absorption. It's one of those stupid, low-profile, ridiculous things, the rubber band tires that provides no cushion at all, essentially. So since the body of the car has a lot of mass, the net force is going to be extremely high, and in this case would actually cause the tire to jump up off the ground. So when you have the suspension, the springs carry the vehicle weight. The net force exerted on the vehicle when you hit a bump is only on the unsprung weight of the vehicle. So unsprung weight is any kind of load that's not carried by the springs. The wheels, the tires, the suspension arms, etc. So the mass is much, much smaller in this case because we have a suspension, and therefore the net force is significantly less. So, talking about spring energy, the spring stores the energy when it is compressed, and it releases when it rebounds. Essentially, the spring will change in energy as it changes its length. When the vehicle hits a bump, the force of the wheel pushing upwards will compress the spring. Now the spring will try to return back to a state of rest, and that exerts the force back down on the wheel, effectively pushing the wheel back down onto the ground. So the question is, why do we still feel motion when we hit a bump? Well, unless you're driving some Cadillac or something like that, that's nice and floaty. You got to think about it this way: as the spring has inertia and stiffness, the spring is not capable of absorbing 100% of the force of the bump. So some of the force is going to be transferred through the spring and into the body. Since the spring absorbs the majority of the force, the bump will be far less harsh. The next thing we're going to talk about is the shock absorbers. The term shock absorber is a bit of a misnomer. What a shock absorber does is it provides resistance during suspension movement. It technically does not absorb the shock of the bump, even though it does have compressive resistance when the shock absorber is actually flexed. So what it does is it dampens the natural oscillation that occurs when you flex a spring. Now, in a perfect frictionless world, if you gave a spring some amount of energy to compress it or extend it, and then let it go, the spring would continue to compress and extend indefinitely. So basically what the shock absorber does, or better known as a damper, is it prevents the vehicle from continuing to bounce when you flex a suspension. So if you had no shock absorbers, the vehicle would just bounce and bounce and bounce when you hit a bump. So without any kind of damping, the vehicle would be very hard to control. So one of the oldest type of shocks is called a twin tube shock. It is a cheap, low-level economy shock, and it uses oil channeled through piston valves to dampen the motion of the springs. Now, the problem with a twin tube shock is that the oil inside it has a tendency to foam from overheating after being cycled repeatedly, i.e. a rough road or anything like that. So what that does, that reduces the shock's effectiveness. So as the oil begins to foam, the vehicle will tend to bounce and oscillate when you hit a bump. So the compression and the rebound stiffness is controlled by the valve orifices on the piston and the base valves. As you can see by my Microsoft Paint drawing here, so our inner tube has the piston valve in it, and the piston valve will move up and down with the motion of the vehicle. And that will force the oil not only through the piston valve, but through the base valve and into the outer tube. So The more later versions are a monotube shock. So this ditches the base valve and the outer tube for a single tube design. This exposes the tube to air, which aids cooling of the shock oil. And now this requires tighter tolerances than the twin tubes, and thus they're a little bit more expensive to manufacture. Again, the shock stiffness is adjusted by the orifice size only in the piston valve itself, since there is no base valve. So this is basically a monotube shock, fairly simple, has an inner tube and a piston valve, and that's about it. So an update on this is the gas-charged monotube, since a single tube shock will still result in some amount of foaming of the oil once it starts to get heated up. So what a gas-charged monotube shock does is this uses a gas-filled chamber, generally nitrogen, with a piston inside it to apply pressure to the shock oil. Increasing the pressure on the oil will prevent the oil from foaming by increasing the vapor pressure of the oil. If you watched my air conditioning lecture video, you'll know all about vapor pressures. So these are even more expensive to manufacture than standard monotube shocks, although these are much, much more fade resistant, unlike the other designs. So this is kind of a cutaway of what a gas-charged monotube looks like. So the free piston basically forms a barrier between the shock oil and the actual gas chamber. And like I said, the gas chamber is generally filled with nitrogen because nitrogen is inert, and so it won't promote any kind of corrosion, and it's not explosive, it won't burn or anything like that. So the last one is a remote reservoir shock, which is kind of a variation on the gas-charged monotube. So basically what it does is it externally mounts a reservoir that has the oil and the nitrogen gas charge. The extra volume of oil allows for the better heat distribution as well as increased cooling capacity. Generally, you see these on big off-road vehicles, stuff like that. Even some race vehicles do have a variation on this design. The same disadvantage is that it is way more expensive to manufacture. So the reservoir can be awkward to mount in a limited space application. So this is kind of what a remote reservoir shock looks like. So you have the remote reservoir with the free piston and the nitrogen gas in it, and the piston valve moves up and down within the tube, just like a normal shock. So that's shock absorbers in a nutshell. So now we're going to talk about the two generic types of suspension. So there's two basic categories. We have what we call a solid axle suspension, used for many, many years, long time, still used today, but kind of a bit of an archaic design. And we have an independent suspension, which is very, very widely used today, especially in a lot of commuter cars nowadays. So, solid axle suspensions, they're generally used on the rear of rear-wheel drive vehicles and very, very commonly on pickup trucks, just because of their kind of design and application. They can be used for drive and non-drive axles, although generally solid axle, non-drive axles have kind of gone the way of the dodo, with the exception of kind of heavy-duty trucks. They're much, much more robust and stronger than an independent suspension. But they do not handle as well as an independent suspension, just because that massive chunk of steel that gets bolted to a set of springs provides a huge increase in unsprung weight. And it requires a spring and a location method to hold the axle into place. So we have two main types of solid axle suspension. We have a leaf spring and a multi-link. So leaf spring is old school, still used today, was used for centuries before that, even on like coach and buggy applications. The leaf spring has stood the test of time forever. So basically this is the setup right here. You're looking at basically the axle tube. This is a drive axle. You can tell by the differential pumpkin in the middle there. We had our shock absorbers inboard of the springs, and the two big long round things are the leaf springs. So the advantages of a leaf spring, very simple. Strong. Used actually more on 3/4, 1 ton, and even heavier trucks, even on full-size transport trucks. They do not require any kind of trailing arms or linkages because the spring is actually strong enough to hold the axle into place. And it controls chassis roll because they don't really flex from side to side too well. The disadvantages to a leaf spring is it doesn't really allow much in the way of articulation. The way that the leaf springs compress, it doesn't really allow the axle to roll kind of left and right. Doesn't exactly provide the best of ride comfort. The axle will generally tend to twist during hard acceleration, causing something called axle wrap, which is what causes the U-joint to bind up while you're driving. So, to combat this, we have two methods. The one is called a slapper bar. So, basically what this does is this prevents the spring from twisting. So, a slapper bar is a cheap and effective way to eliminate U-joint bind. So, slapper bar is a very simple system. It's bolted to the axle U-bolts, which hold the axle into the spring. It has a bump stop on the end of it that pushes up against the front spring eye and prevents the entire axle from twisting under hard loading. That is the application of what a slapper bar looks like. Again, simple yet effective. The other one is called a traction bar. Traction bar does the same thing as a slapper bar, but in a different way. So what it does is it attaches to the bottom of the axle tube at one end and to the vehicle frame at the other. The bar has a rotating joint at both ends to allow the suspension to travel up and down. But under acceleration, the axle twisting actually pushes against the bar and transfers the force into the frame, which prevents the axle from rotating. So this is an application of a traction bar. This is actually kind of like a heavy-duty lifted suspension. So the other kind is a multi-link. So generally this is used with a coil spring or a coil-over setup. Multi-links do provide a much better ride than leaf springs. The trailing arms prevent the axle from twisting during acceleration, but there's more bushings and components to wear out, and it's just not as heavy duty as the leaf spring. There's much less unsprung weight in this scenario. So, there's many different types of multi-link suspensions. Each have their own disadvantages and advantages. We have a trailing arm, a 3-link, ladder bars, parallel 4-link with panhard bar, also sometimes called a 5-link, a triangulated 4-link. The sky's the limit with these things. So trailing arm, simple yet effective. These are kind of old school. Still used in NASCAR today, but was used all the way back to the 60s. So the old Chevy C10s are the first thing that come to my mind. Provides actually decent ride quality and handling, but the heavy trailing arms can add unsprung weight to the vehicle since the coil spring actually sits on the trailing arms themselves. There's no pivot point on the axle, so what this does is this causes your pinion angle to change as the suspension flexes. This is a trailing arm setup. This again is off of an old C10 Chevrolet from the 60s, early 70s type of thing. So a 3-link is another type of suspension. This actually provides the least amount of trade-offs for any suspension. It's simple and lightweight. It provides flexibility and articulation without the arms causing any kind of bind. But this requires a lot of space above the axle because of the top link is not really well suited for street application. And it also requires a panhard bar, which is a bar that goes across the axle to keep the axle from walking left to right. As you can see here in this view, we have our 3-link suspension system, kind of from a top view and from a side view. Usually these bars are threaded and adjustable, and as you can see, our panhard bar right here keeps the axle from walking side to side. Very, very important. So ladder bars. They have similar advantages to trailing arms, but the ladder bar is actually fixed to 2 points on the axle, but only 1 on the frame. There's much less unsprung weight since the springs are actually mounted directly to the axle. Now, an adjustable ladder bar setup will actually allow fine-tuning of the axle center line and any kind of alignment angles from the rear and also the pinion angle. Now, these tend to bind during articulation, so not really the best kind of use in kind of an off-road scenario type of thing. This is what a ladder bar setup looks like. You can tell by the drag slicks that this is actually used in a drag car. So the next type is a parallel 4-link. The link bars are actually connected to the axle and to the frame. There's 4 of them, hence the term 4-link. When looking downward at the bars, they all run parallel to each other. Aftermarket systems are adjustable, providing different loading characteristics for increasing traction and reducing rear end squat during acceleration. So depending on how you have your bars adjusted, you can actually determine how the rear suspension reacts when you hit the throttle really hard. These are great for drag racing. For that exact reason, you can put all the weight on the back axle when you go to accelerate, which increases your traction. So a panhard bar is also used to keep the rear end from walking side to side. These are very difficult to install and quite costly in the aftermarket. They tend to roll bind like other methods, and actually Ram 1500 trucks use a very similar system. However, the links are actually angled outwards to stop the axle from walking side to side. The later ones have a fifth link on the top of the differential to further control axle roll. So this is an example of a parallel four-link system. You can see up top, these are actually our sway bars. In this case, we have a coilover setup, and this big old C-notch in the frame allow us to slam the truck right down into the weeds. I think this is actually a truck frame. I actually believe that this is, again, a Chevy C10 frame, but don't quote me on that. And the last one we have is our triangulated four-link. So what this does is this eliminates the use of a panhard bar, as the triangulated links actually prevent the axle from walking side to side. This allows for good articulation of the suspension. Very popular in 4x4 applications. The angled bars do provide a little clearance to things like exhaust and fuel tanks, so you got to be careful of that if you're installing them. The double triangulated setup provides even more articulation and flex. So that's when all four bars kind of go out at an angle. So in this case, this is a single triangulated four-link, so you can see our bottom links angle inwards and our top links are straight. And a double triangulated four-link would have these two top bars angled outwards, again providing more stiffness from the axle from walking from side to side. So that's about it for me. This is the end of part 1. In part 2, we're going to go into more independent suspension methods and stuff like that. So please stay tuned. I'm hoping to have that out by next week. Thank you everyone for watching, and if you haven't already done so, please subscribe. Follow me Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at 6Speed Dakota. Take it easy, everyone.